Well, this is a little bit of a proto intermission, and I'll get straight to the point here. The discussion in today's topic was filmed roughly around late March, I'd say. Was somewhere, imagine somewhere early in the year, because that's when we were available for me and Harry to do this episode. Unfortunately, we're weeks away, as of this recording, from releasing this episode, and since then, new news has come to light regarding Game of Thrones and the other spin-offs in the works. And after this situation, and just for context, if people know what I'm referring to, it's essentially confirmation of certain spin-offs. But yeah, that's that aside. In moments like this, we would naturally, of course, have to redo certain segments or the entire episode in this case, which I was actually more than happy to do. Unfortunately, Harry is unavailable for the next few weeks because personal life and all that. And yeah, I want to respect that because he was quite busy throughout the early half of this year, and he's going to be quite busy still. But he was able to put some time aside to film some episodes. So I really am grateful for him for doing that. And despite all that, I also really did enjoy this episode. So we're going to put it out regardless, despite the fact that it's a little bit behind the times. But you know what? I think we are allowed to be a little bit. We're allowed to have little bit of a leeway in being left behind. But regardless, I do apologise in that regard. But still, I hope you all enjoyed the discussion, and who knows, maybe we might touch on the newer news in a future episode, maybe. We'll see. For now, hope you enjoy. So Harry, it's been a few months, well, sort of since Game of Thrones came back with House of the Dragon, and have you finished the series yet?
Yeah, House of the Dragon, I have finished it. I really enjoyed it.
Gotta say, I was going in, I was excited and nervous, and the first episode definitely hooked me. Now, having seen the full series, I've got to say I'm impressed and kind of shocked that it turned out so good the way it did. Because in this age right now of entertainment, that's sometimes okay, sometimes great, but only rarely great. Because a lot of the times it's just very disappointing, lackluster, or at the most it's okay, but you can see where it could be so much better. But I feel like this was
what I've seen
so
recently
good.
with lots of TV is that people say, "Oh, it gets better." You have to bear with the bad, 2 or 3 episodes, and then it gets good. And I'm like, no, I don't want that. Just give me a good thing to start with, and then I'll spend my time watching that. And that's what I thought with House of the Dragon. I was instantly hooked.
Yeah, I love how every character starts at a point where you can see where their story sets everything up, how every character has a role that plays into their own story and the bigger story going forward. And again, for a show that I was honestly not too shocked about, shocked about is the word. What I'm trying to say is that, in a roundabout way, is that I went in fully expecting to think they would just treat the story as black and white, but I was so impressed that they were very subtle about it, how they treated all the characters. As there wasn't like one good person, there wasn't one bad person, because Game of Thrones, as good as the early seasons were in their writing, in how they portrayed characters, and how sometimes they were grey, sometimes they were good and all bad, you could definitely say these are the people who are our heroes and these are the people who are our villains. But with these characters in House of the Dragon, you can see they weren't cruel people, but through their actions they did very cruel things, or things that basically had big consequences for everyone.
Sure. I mean, I sort of disagree slightly, whereas in Game of Thrones I think that there was a lot of nuance. There was a lot of characters that I don't think were just good or just bad, but that, like you said, in the early seasons. But in the later seasons, like season 8 I think was the last one, that's when it was, you have good characters, you have bad characters, and there was no in between. But like for the early Game of Thrones, like especially maybe characters like Jaime, where at the beginning you're like, oh, this person's horrible, you're never gonna like this guy, and then like he goes through some stuff, and you're like, oh, maybe he's like redeemable, and like maybe there is more to him than just being evil. And I think there was a lot of that with a lot of characters. Like the Hound was like on the surface really nasty and really horrible, but like he's actually he was like a really like solid guy. Like for Sansa, he was like really like gentle and sweet, but he was like with the exterior of like gruffness.
Yeah, and even minor characters like Osha, who literally starts off with her first appearance threatening the life of Bran Stark, and by the end of that season, she doesn't become completely changed, but she's clearly working in favour of the heroes by the end of the season. And again, a lot of those kind of things, the subtlety of that storytelling, we did lose that as Thrones neared its end. So it was a nice welcome change to see that brought back in this show, in this writing. And again,
and I think that's easy because I think that's easy because George R. R. Martin was heavily involved with this season. I think the nuance and the characters being like so excellently written was because he was really involved with it.
Yeah, that's definitely a bonus. And again, we won't go into out external details, but in comparison to other shows that were coming out at the time, a little Middle Earth series, which we will not name. Yeah, my God, that show was just like a breath of fresh air. Yeah, just rounding out the House of the Dragon section here. They, of course, announced season 2 is happening, and excellent. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh yeah, me too, 100%.
Okay, so that little sort of a prologue out of the way. So again, with these episodes, I'd say you'd think we'd get used to it, finding a structure, and we do have a bit of structure, but at the end of the day, this is just us talking. So
yeah, I was gonna say, to be honest, we could talk about House of the Dragon for hours, probably.
We could, but there were some things I'd rather we talk about right now, which is the other spin-offs that were in development for a time with concurrently with House of the Dragon, and as of lately, some of them have been. It seems that some of them have been cancelled, or at the very least put on the back burner, which we will talk about a bit more later. But in short, I feel like it'd be a bit of fun for us to just talk about some of these projects and what we think about them. In concept,
yeah, for sure. A lot of these I didn't actually know were genuine spin-offs. Like I knew a lot of them were people suggesting what they'd like to see for spin-offs, but I didn't realise that these were actually going to be made.
Really?
Yeah, like, I mean, at one point they were going to be made, but as we'll talk about, not anymore.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so talking about the first spin-off here, again, we're not doing this in any specific order, but I think I just highlight these ones just because I think they're interesting. So the first spin-off that was on the roster was one called The Sea Snake. Now, this is a prequel to House of the Dragon, actually. And again, I've written my own summary here just to make it simple. But essentially, this series retells the story, or retails the story of young Corlys Velaryon, aka the Sea Snake, and his famous 9 voyages across the lands of Westeros. So essentially, it's all about him going on these seafaring adventures from the polar wastes of the Shivering Sea to the far east of the Jade Sea. Essentially, it's basically Pirates of the Caribbean, but in Westeros. Essentially, and this is something that I thought it was good to highlight this one first because, as we know, if you've seen Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, he is a character who is in House of the Dragon. He's a very good character too.
I was going to ask, do we know who the Sea Snake is? Because I can't exactly remember who the Sea Snake is. It was in House of the Dragon.
He was Corlys. He was the one with the dreadlocks. He was like one of the prominent becoming characters.
Oh right. So this was supposed to be like an actual. Because when you say it was a prequel to House of the Dragon, I thought it might have just been set before House of the Dragon, like how House of the Dragon's a prequel to Game of Thrones. But it was actually a genuine prequel to the actual show and the events that happened in the show and the characters. I didn't realize that.
In concept, yeah, because these were all pitched as prequels, and I have no idea off the top of my head if this was pitched alongside or in of its own intent before House of the Dragon was in development. But this is essentially meant to be the same character, and considering how he was well received in House of the Dragon and how House of the Dragon came first, if this project was to go forward, it would naturally, of course, be connected and thus retroactively be a prequel about Corlys. Yeah. But yeah, this series is as the title suggests, well, the series suggests, it's basically about the adventures of young Corlys Velaryon, and I would say, out of all the spin-offs that we could get, I would say this would definitely be an okay one to start with, especially if, again, considering how much people have enjoyed House of the Dragon, if they wanted to see more of that world with those characters, more specifically with this character, because the Velaryons, they weren't introduced in the Thrones show, but they were somewhat acknowledged in the books. So this season was essentially their debut. So if fans really do gravitate to them and into season 2 and the subsequent seasons going forward, this is definitely one approach that I believe could work.
To be honest, I've never been, in regards to Game of Thrones, I've never been interested in like the seafaring characters, or like when characters go on voyages and go on ships. I don't know why. What part of me doesn't like it? I guess actually that makes sense, because one of my actual fears in life is shipwrecks. So maybe it's like a subconscious thing, and I'm just like, don't look at the sea and the ships. But yeah, I've never been really interested in that sort of aspect of Game of Thrones. I've always been more interested in like the politics of like when they're in like the chambers and or like knights fighting. But like the sea stuff isn't really my bag. But I was just thinking, if this was a spin-off where it's just about the Velaryons, I hope they get a better wig budget and don't just have like pieces of wool or whatever it is in his hair, because that's my one point about that character, is that his wig was a bit rubbish.
Yeah, I wouldn't deny at points it was kind of ridiculous. I mean, it definitely grew on me over time, but even I was among those few saying, "Really? That's the look you're going for?"
Yeah, okay. that's the people, the professional people got paid to do that. Okay.
I'll give you this. At least it was better than Tyrion's beard in the last episode.
Sure. Yep. Sure. That's fine. Yeah.
But yeah. So yeah. Okay. So yeah. Was expecting that response. But
sure. Makes sense. Would you be interested in that sort of a show?
Honestly, I would, primarily because he was, again, unlike insert Lord of the Rings show here, but unlike that show where every character was just not fun, not investing at all, I was really invested in a lot of the characters in House of the Dragon and Corlys, because even though he had his own agenda, and you could definitely look at him as being almost a somewhat antagonist in certain episodes, you definitely saw his side of the story and how his motives influenced him in his actions, and you really got to understand him and why he did what he did and tried to do. And I really found his character enjoyable and likable at points. So, in light of this concept, I would be all for seeing a prequel exploring his seafaring adventures, not only just because he's a character that I would like to see more of, but he's also a character that has an advantage compared to a lot of the characters that we had in Thrones, at least when it came to the main story that they were telling, because there wasn't a lot of seafaring travels that we got to see for adventure purposes. Because the whole point of this series, this spin-off, if it were to be made, would it be about him going to fantastical, exotic locations that we've never seen before? And again, like as they said, the Jade Sea, or we've of course been to Volantis, but stuff, places like Yee, and I can't remember the names off the top of my head, but there are exotic jungles and places that have almost dragon-like lizard dinosaur creatures, and there's so many other amazing locations in the known world of Game of Thrones that have merit in the books that we could definitely see brought to life for a television audience. It's just a
because I
matter
guess
of
in
finding
Game
a
of
story
Thrones and
that
House
can
of
get
the
us
Dragon,
there.
yeah, but in House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, you only really see Westeros. You don't really see anything else, and there's like a whole other continent on the map that has never been visited. So yeah, I guess that it would be, for a spin-off to Game of Thrones. I guess with House of the Dragon, it's very much incredibly similar to Game of Thrones, just like with characters that are a bit older and the sort of conflicts are a bit different. But like as far as like the structure of the show, it's very similar. Where it's like it's a Game of Thrones basically, but to have a spin-off that's like in the same world as Game of Thrones, but with a completely different story and premise, I think that would be quite interesting, rather than like just repeating everything we've seen before. Go completely left field and literally go to places we've never seen before with characters we don't really know. I think that's a sort of better way to structure a spin-off. I mean, like House of Dragon is really good. It's just like we do know, and I guess it's a good way to start a series of spin-offs for Game of Thrones by doing something you're familiar with, so that it's like familiar but different. But then with this one, it would be completely different.
Yeah, this would definitely, again, if this was to be the next one confirmed, this would definitely be a deviation from the formula, which I think would complement it. Sort of like with how we've talked so many times about Fantastic Beasts, how that series of films should have been about something completely different, instead of just, let's do another war event, let's do another Darkness.
We're back at Hogwarts again.
Heroes. Yeah, we need to get back at Hogwarts.
Yeah.
If the Game of Thrones, if it was to continue making spin-offs, they need to do more than just fight for a throne. And a show about a young, handsome and dashing captain of a ship traveling to these exotic lands and meeting fantastical places, people, and fighting off against creatures and bandits and pirates. That story, again, is a great concept of itself.
That does sound fun.
Yeah, and to put that into the world of Game of Thrones with all these fantastical creatures and characters and locations, I think would be a benefit, especially if they want to try something that drastic. At the same time, though, I can also see why they probably wouldn't go with it, because Corlys is a character who is still on House of the Dragon, and that does open the door of, why should we care about this character in any of these situations, because we know he survives and goes on to the events of House of the Dragon. And so that is one downside to it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I guess that's the way with many prequels, is that there isn't really tension for that character, because you know that they'll be fine. And to be honest, when we were talking about this, I even said that I didn't remember who he was. He wasn't really one of my favourite characters, and like, he was great. He was fine as a character in the show, but he was a side character in the show. Really. And I don't think, me personally, I don't think a whole series with him as the lead would be my sort of favourite thing to see.
Yeah, I feel like it could work, but the story would have to be really, really good in investing for us to capture us, especially if the show were to be a multiple season project. But yeah, I guess wrapping up on this first section, I feel like this is definitely a spin-off that I could see happening, but I can see why they decided to put it on hold, especially considering how they want to see where things go with House of the Dragon first.
Yeah, like, totally, I agree. They'll see where House of Dragon, and I think after the first season of House of Dragon, because it works so well, if a second season also is well received, then I think they'll sort of probably greenlight so many other projects. But yeah, I guess to conclude, to wrap it up, sort of thing, is like, it's a good premise. Like, it's very different, it's very out there, but like, the actual elements, personally for me, I don't think I'd be interested in, like sea, traveling with that bloke. Doesn't really appeal to me.
Yeah. Okay, so going on to the next segment then, the next spin-off. This is a spin-off that I think we just breeze through because I think you can guess why. But this is a spin-off that's directly tied to Dawn. Now, in short, this spin-off would be called 10,000 Ships. At least that's the tentative title. And this tells the story of the Princess Nymeria of the Rhoynar, and who basically leads her people after their defeat in the devastating war with the Valyrian Dragon Lords. She basically then rallies the survivors from that conflict and flees to Essos in a refugee fleet of 10,000 ships, hence the name, in search of a new home.
Wow.
Their journey will take them to many different lands around the Summer Sea, from the dinosaur-infested jungles of Sophoros, I believe that's how it's pronounced, to the tropical paradises of the Summer Islands, before they finally migrate to Dawn, becoming the ancestors of the modern Dornishmen and House Martell. So in not so many words, this entire story is basically a one big prequel to how did House Martell come to be? And again, I would say, in not so many words, the concept is interesting, but again, when you look at the characters from Game of Thrones and how the Dawn storyline was done, and we've talked about this a few times before in other episodes, that wasn't read.
No, it would be a very poor choice of characters to focus on, given that no one really cares about the Dornish.
Yeah, I think the frustrating thing is that because Thrones fucked it up so bad with the parent show, that is like genuinely again, as someone who tried reading, I've read the books a few years ago at this point, but it's been a long time since I read them recently, and I'm even now I'm trying to struggle to remember how the plots differ. But I do know that Dawn is a lot more interesting in the books and even in the prequel stuff, at least in content wise. So I think if they were to just like make this, and I just saw it before I saw Game of Thrones, I actually think it would have benefited and I would enjoy it. But that pre-existing the pre-existing feelings of just like being disappointed by that interpretation, I feel like it would be very difficult to get people's interest in this concept series, even though, again, all things considered, it's a completely separate, entity of itself, really, because it's really telling its own original story in comparison to conflicts with the throne and such, or sea captain voyages. But I wouldn't say this is again, short of making this one short and sweet, this is not one of my most anticipated spin-offs.
No, I guess the way that they could possibly do it so it's actually popular, again, like you said, it's going to be difficult to market it to people, given that all the mainstream audiences know is that in Game of Thrones that was a boring subplot. The only character that was interesting, in my opinion, was Oberyn, and then like a couple of the others, and they all died. Spoilers. But I think the only way of actually doing it well would be to, rather than making it like a prequel to the show, would be making it just a straight up adaptation from the books, if you know what I mean. Like, don't try and make it, obviously you have to keep it under the Game of Thrones family and like brand, but don't make it a prequel to Game of Thrones. Make it a completely separate story, and maybe don't market it as, do you remember Dawn? This is them. Don't do that. Just make it a story of these people traveling and making a settlement and making like a culture and society. I think that's an easy way of doing it, or sort of a better way of doing it than making it a straight up prequel. Just a quick thing before we go on to the next one. From your description of the actual of the summary of the plot, it to me sounds a little bit like Daenerys' story, where she like is exiled and has to find, like, gathers a bunch of people and makes her way to these different towns to, like, start a like a society, I guess, except ending nicely with, like, an actual proper family rather than ending with whatever happened in Game of Thrones.
Yeah, I can definitely see there would be parallels in that regard. And I'm just thinking, like, I mean, add on the stigma that Dawn has. Also, when you're just reading the description alone, that summary description, that plot summary there, that just feels expensive to start.
Yeah.
I mean, the pilot episode alone would have to start off with a battle probably to show, like, the conflicts that led to these characters going on this long voyage, and the locations they'd have to go to. And again, granted, HBO has shown that they can pull off grand stuff with stuff like Thrones and The Last of Us and a few other shows, but for a spin-off that is entirely focused on essentially a location and a event that is tied to a subplot, there would have to be for one thing, swimming with money to actually guarantee this show would be made, but also be confident in the story.
Sure. I mean, like, to be honest, you're saying that, like, if Game of Thrones and the spin-offs, like, they have more and they get more popular and then HBO has more money, then I can see them being able to afford it, because if Game of Thrones is so popular, then they'll be able to just throw money at anything. Like, the more popular it becomes, the more money they'll put into all these spin-offs. So yeah, down the line maybe they'll be able to do it, but that is if they do it at all, which I don't think they will.
Yeah, with this one, I wouldn't lose sleep if we didn't get this one. But if it does end up happening down the line, I might check out the first episode just to see how they pull it off. Because again, I was very up and down with myself if I was going to like House of the Dragon, and episode 1 immediately hooked me. It really got me interested to see what would happen next. I remained skeptical until I watched the full season, but if they can hook me with a good first episode, I would be all down for at least seeing how this one goes. But at the same time, I will also stand by that. Yeah, I don't think every one of these spin-offs needs to see the light of day.
No, exactly. Yeah.
So the next spin-off is, I would say, the guaranteed one to happen, primarily just because, unlike the previous two spin-offs we discussed, this one actually has short story installments, books, source material backing it. Because the previous two ones, they have source material, but they aren't books, they aren't stories about these characters. They're just more like encyclopedias or poems or songs about their history, and the basic big stuff, but you don't know stories about the characters. This is a story about a character. Have you heard of Duncan Egg?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we've talked about it on a podcast before.
We did. We briefly touched on it before. And for summary, and for everyone else, if you're listening, if you don't know somehow, the Hedge Knight, Duncan Egg is essentially a spin-off of Game of Thrones. It's a short story, a series of short stories about this Hedge Knight, this knight called Sir Duncan the Tall, and he basically, in not so many words, goes off around Westeros, doing nightly things, basically trying to make a living as a honourable Hedge Knight, and he ends up coming across this young kid, and they basically start connecting when he accepts him as his squire. And when they go to a tourney, and the Targaryens are there, and there's all these other great houses, and through shenanigans, again without spoiling it, so people can actually read the story for themselves, essentially they end up going off on adventures together. So the Hedge Knight follows the adventures of Sir Duncan the Tall and his squire from the crown cities of King's Landing to the cold walls of Winterfell. This series will explore the tales and endeavours of a humble Hedge Knight, and how the known world will forever remember him as Westeros' greatest and most honourable knights. I'm also quite proud of that summary.
Very good. You made that?
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, it's very, very, very poetic.
Mm. And yeah, if it wasn't obvious already, this show would essentially be about a Hedge Knight going off on his Hedge Knight adventures around Westeros. And unlike the other spin-offs, this would be relatively easy to make because it is essentially more about retreading familiar locations, but less about political drama or dragons or exotic locations and big conflicts and battles. This is literally just about two people going on a road trip, essentially.
Yeah, this to me, out of all the spin-offs that we're going to talk about today, I think this is my favourite one because it sort of it's like what I loved about House of the Dragon, where it was Game of Thrones again, but with a more streamlined set of characters. So like House of the Dragon is like the conflicts of one family rather than like all these families across the whole of Westeros and all these different storylines. It was one story, and this will be that but streamlined again, so it's two characters, and like the two characters are the main focus, and there's sort of no other plot lines. It's just those two going around. It's funny because it sounds quite whimsical. Like Game of Thrones is really nasty and horrible and grim and grimy, but this kind of like this the way it sounds to me is like, oh yeah, it's two people going on an adventure. But if it was just two people, like literally just those two, like a knight and his squire, sort of wandering around like forests and then going to tournaments and going to castles, that sounds great. That sounds really fun to me. That's like my cup of tea.
Yeah, I'm sure it would have its moments of dark conflicts, because I do know that they go to locations like Winterfell, and King's Landing is a location that I think will become more prominent as the series, if the series goes on in books and TV form, because we do know from later canon that Sir Duncan ends up becoming, a bit of a spoiler here, but again, he becomes very well connected with the Targaryen dynasty. So yeah, they definitely have a lot of ground that they could cover. But yeah, again, in not so many words, this is a spin-off that I think is likely to happen, primarily because I think, again, unlike the other ones, there is source material behind this. The only downside is that there's only 4 short stories out, and Martin has, I think he acknowledged that he was planning to make 10.
So that could be like 10 episodes.
No, I guess more intense. In more intense, that there would be 10 short stories, because a lot of people, from what I've heard, at least among the fans, they believe that they could definitely pull off a whole first season with the first short story.
Oh really? Wow. Oh, I thought it was like really short. Okay. Oh well, that'd be great. I think because if it's literally taken from his writing, it'll be like how the first couple of seasons of Game of Thrones were like really good, because it was literally adaptation and not making up stuff. So if it was taken from his actual stories, then I think it would just be better. Yeah, that's this is like one of the ones I'm like genuinely hope gets made, and I think because it's talked about all the time, especially in regards to like spin-offs. So I think if they're going to do more spin-offs for Game of Thrones, then this, like you said, this is most likely to be one that they're still doing. Do you know much about like the development of this? Do you know if it actually has been talked about or as a series?
As of this recording, we do know for sure that it's been in development for a while, and Martin has confirmed that it has several working titles. The most current one being the Hedge Knight, and as of now, it's currently on I wouldn't say the back burner, but it's definitely halted in development, because I believe one of the HBO execs announced a while ago that they are putting all their focus into, or at the very least they're keeping their focus on House of the Dragon, and they're going to hold off on doing any more big spin-offs for a while, but it's still on the cards for we might come back to this at a later point. So
I mean, to be honest, that I don't mind the sound of that. Like, I like that they don't want to just go mad with spin-offs like how Disney do, where they like, yes, let's make a series about every possible character and setup we possibly can. I like that they're like, we're doing House of Dragon now, we're going to focus on that, and then maybe we'll do some later. They're not saying no, but they're not saying right now. So that sounds fine.
Yeah. So the last spin-off I would like us to acknowledge is one that's a bit different. Actually, this one would actually be an animated series, and this is a series that would be based around the Golden Empire of Yi Ti. And again, not so many words. It's basically a location east of Quarth.
Isn't that the alien from the Spielberg movie?
No, it's E.T. Sue Mountain. But, no, it's
not that E.T. then.
No,
okay.
No. It's I'm just picturing how E.T. came along and created a civilization in Westeros.
yeah. E.T. phone, and then he gets his head chopped off. They wouldn't let him stay around for very long. He wouldn't last long in Game of Thrones.
No. No. Okay, so Yi Ti is essentially the Game of Thrones equivalent of Imperial China, and
right.
It's again, people have talked about this one to death. So in not so, again, repeating myself in not so many words, this is more a spin-off that, as far as we know, has no, again, direct source material. It's mostly just, it has a chapter about its history and some of its notable, historical moments, I think, acknowledged in one of the source books, I believe, like the Worlds of Ice and Fire or something. But there's no, again, direct story narrative or source material backing this pitch. So it really would boil down to what original stuff they can make with Martin's help. But I think what's really attractive to this one for me is primarily the fact that it's animated, and the fact that it's basically, again, set in a location that is not tied to Westeros at all. Because for me, the big standout, this goes back to when we talked about in our first Game of Thrones podcast episode. I remember being heavily invested in E.T. purely for the one concept piece of information that they possibly had a connection to the White Walkers because of I think it was one of their cruel emperors who like, apparently, again, in the text, he apparently raised the dead or something, and there were parallels between him and the Night King, essentially. But of course, we know how the White Walkers turned out. But yeah, and I think they also have their version of the wall, like this big black gate that leads into nowhere, and people felt that might have connected to, the land beyond the land beyond winter. But yeah, essentially, those possible nuggets aside, this show really doesn't have this series doesn't have any other big narrative ties to it, so it really would have to be an original story.
It's not something that I'm like incredibly excited about, or not to be harsh, but it's not really something I care about, to be honest, because I've never really heard of it before. But the idea of doing a Game of Thrones spin-off as an animated show, would it be like a mini series? It wouldn't be like a whole like 10 episode thing, would it?
Probably. I mean, I guess it really depends on what story they decide to do, because animation, in comparison to live action, I would say that it's definitely costly, but it would also be, I would say, that tad bit easier, because they could get away with stuff that you probably wouldn't be able to do in live action. So they could do 10 episodes. Alternatively, they could choose to just do 6 or maybe even 3 if they do it like Sherlock, where it's like each episode is like 2 hours or something.
Yeah. Right. Sure, it's just because I was thinking that if they choose, because it would be Game of Thrones. I think if they did an animated Game of Thrones, it wouldn't be like anime, or it wouldn't be like those horrible sitcoms where it's like the Star Trek one where it's like Star Trek but animated and funny. They wouldn't do that. I think animated Game of Thrones, I think the animation style would be more akin to the only thing I can think of, like on top of my head, of this style would be like in the Deathly Hallows, Harry Potter, when like they're reading the Deathly Hallows, or the Tale of the Three Brothers story, and it's like Hermione reading it, and it's the like black and white animation. It's not. It wouldn't be that like, you know, edgy, but like that style of animation where it's more like serious and more artistic, because it'd be for an adult audience, so you wouldn't want to go for, and it'd be for an adult audience, and for a serious matter it wouldn't be like comedy, so it'd have to be a really like elegant art style, and I don't think they would want to do that for an entire series, like an entire 10 episode thing, and with the sort of source material, it would be like completely everything new, and it's all about this ancient, I keep using the word society, I can't think of any other word, this ancient culture, this ancient race. I don't think they'd probably focus too much on specific characters, maybe like the emperor of this place, and I don't think it's the sort of thing they would like go into nitty gritty little details about. It'd be more like a sort of, have you ever seen those Game of Thrones animations that they did on YouTube? Yeah, I think it'd be something more akin to that than to a straight up like Game of Thrones style show.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, I envision that if they was to happen, they would probably try to aim more similar to animation like in Castlevania. Have you seen that series?
I have not.
Look it up briefly if you want to get an idea of the animation.
I will.
But yeah, that's a series that I think could be a good blueprint for them if they wanted to go forward with animation. Again, that's a show I need to watch, because I've heard nothing but good things about it.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. I don't think they would go. It's anime. It's more like anime than anything, and I don't think they'd go for a Game of Thrones anime. It just doesn't seem like the sort of thing that they would go for. That's why I said it'd be more akin to the one in Harry Potter, where it's like sort of not style less, but like it wouldn't be. They wouldn't be going for a style that already exists, I don't think. They'd go for something different so it would stand out. For Game of Thrones, I don't think they would go for straight up anime.
No, you never know. I mean, who knows? For all we know, they could be trying to go for their own art style, or maybe they might try something completely different, or maybe they might try and be shit like just discount Star Trek Rick and Morty.
Yeah, I really hope they don't do that.
God, I hope not too. But yeah, I mean, I could see this being done if they want to tell like a one season, story about maybe the Emperor going through this political conflict that leads to him maybe tying into this bigger story about the long night, or maybe just in general about an original story about this long talked about city. I mean, there's a lot they could do. Again, a lot of these spin-offs have concepts that you could definitely work with, but sort of like the Dawn one, it's almost like there's not a lot for us to really work on, and while there's no negative elements that hold us back from giving this a shot, I do feel like it's hard. It almost feels too disconnected, to the point where it's like, why should we even bother watching this other than the animation has to be good and captivating and the story has to be investing? Because again, you can for all the money you want and all that jazz, but if the story doesn't entice us, again, the rings of power, then you're just like kicking a dead horse, and you're wasting our time. So
yeah,
this spin-off,
and like you were just saying, if the source material or the premise of the show is so far removed from Game of Thrones, I think if it was so far removed that if you didn't call it a Game of Thrones project, you wouldn't tell. I don't think that's a sort of smart thing to do for a spin-off, where the point of the spin-off of Game of Thrones is that you like Game of Thrones, you want to see something that's similar to Game of Thrones. You don't want to see the Mummy, Tomb of the... What was the third Mummy movie where they're in China? I was thinking of that.
Tomb of the Dragon Emperor.
Yeah, that one. You wouldn't want to see that, but like, ain't like it's so like Game of Thrones. I don't think that'd be a particularly sought after project. I guess that's why it'd work for an animation, because it wouldn't, like you said, it wouldn't cost as much to do it, and like if they sort of went on a little short season about this completely out there topic in Game of Thrones lore, if it didn't do well, they could just stop doing it when it wouldn't be much of a loss.
Yeah. I mean, again, with House of the Dragon, we need to have an ending, and with all these other spin-offs, I feel like there would need to be a through-line story that leads to some event. With this one, there's not too much. Again, there's no story. There's literally no story for us to really need to reach a certain point. So theoretically, they could just tell a one-season narrative and then just end it there, cliffhanger or otherwise. Like, end on a cautionary tale rather than, oh, what happened? Tune in next season. It's like, we could end this as if this was like the intended ending.
Yeah, I mean, it literally, like you're saying, it would just be an open ending, because it's so far like back in time, and there isn't even the equivalent. Like, this element of the lore isn't even shown in Game of Thrones, so it wouldn't really matter where you'd end it.
Yeah, so those are the main spin-offs I want us to highlight. There are others, but a lot of them have been either confirmed to be cancelled, or are sort of in a similar state of flux where they could happen down the line, but they're not as. I feel like it's generally like accepted that these aren't prioritized compared to the first four that we've discussed, and I'll just list them off quickly here. There was Bloodmoon, which was originally the first prequel they pitched, but they cancelled. We've talked about this before.
That sounds like
podcasts.
An anime.
No, this actually was live action, and they actually did film a pilot episode. But,
really?
And for context on the story, it was basically a prequel about the conflicts and events of the first Long Night, and the show would have basically been us finding out about the origins of the White Walkers. But
I don't think that sounds like an interesting show, because on the one hand, they sort of did show the origins of the White Walkers in Game of Thrones when the weird leaf ladies shoved a ice dagger in someone's heart. I think some things are better left untold. Like, I don't think every single possible aspect of every like show needs to be addressed. Like, leave some things to the imagination.
I can understand that, but I would also say I would wager that what killed this project was not just because of other reasons. Again, better YouTubers who can explain in depth why this project was cancelled. I'll leave a recommended video in the corner here or something. But I feel like what definitely killed people's enthusiasm for the White Walkers was how they were handled in the final season. Because how they were, a lot of people like us were expecting the show to go into this big, cool narrative about the Walkers being more than they were, more than just a personification of death. We thought there was going to be this big connection to the Stark. We thought there would be this cool way how they would like resolve the story instead of just like killing them or putting them back to sleep. And I feel like that fed into the prequel hype, because we thought, we might have seen the Night King be created, but we don't know who he was like as a human beforehand, or what he was like as the Night King. Was he able to speak before somehow not being able to speak? Did he have alternative motives before he turned against the Children of the Forest? And that's not just counting about him, it's talking about all the other characters and figures in that era of Game of Thrones, like the last hero. What was he like? Was he a Stark? Was he a hero, or was he something else who was just, and history had just interpreted him as a hero because of his actions in defeating the Long Night? There was elements that I think this project could have worked, but I do feel like because of how the TV show handled the White Walkers and their resolution, it definitely left a lot of people feeling like, so they literally were nothing in the end. They weren't that big of a threat to begin with. You just needed one assassin with a good blade. And
Yeah, exactly. No one's going to care where they came from because the conclusion to their story was just so rubbish that it doesn't matter.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so Bloodmoon, sadly, that was never meant to be, and it is a shame. But at the same time, I'm almost glad. I am glad, honestly, because from what I've heard of it, again, video in the description here, I heard it would have been very bad when it came to the writing and the bloody casting, and in terms of just how they bloody handle it. Like, Jesus, we won't get into that. So the other spin-off was, again, last few, I'll breeze through these ones quickly, sorry, because we actually went on a bit of a tangent there. But another one was...
Sorry, I'll try to keep my opinions quiet.
Yeah, so another one was Empire of Ash, and this was basically a prequel about leading up to the events of the Doom of Valyria, which essentially, again, brief context, this was basically the ancestors of Daenerys, the Dragon Lords. You know, they basically ruled the city of Valyria for... Well, not Valyria. The city. I'm blanking on the name. I think it's the Valyria, the Valerian Freehold or something. But essentially, the Targaryens ruled this grand city with dragons everywhere. It was like their golden age of the Roman Empire for them. And essentially, like Pompeii, a volcano happened, and they all died.
Well,
but one faction was able to escape because one of their daughters foresaw it in a vision. So they fled to Westeros.
Oh, like in Doctor Who.
Oh yeah, like that episode. just picture them all with white hair and violet eyes.
Oh.
And dragons. But yeah, so yeah, that show would have essentially been...
And Matt Smith. Oh wait, no, hang on. Never mind.
But yeah, that show would have been about the Dragon Lords. It would have had a lot of dragons, a lot of fire. And this spin-off, again, was one of the early pitches that could have happened, but they decided to put that on the back burner. That could happen someday, but again, we've got House of the Dragon at the moment, and that's doing all the good points. So I would wager they're not too enthusiastic to put out another show that would be about Targaryens again.
And dragons. Yeah, I think the next season of House of the Dragon is going to have probably more dragons. So yeah, they're not going to be like having two dragon shows at the same time. Or actually, they could do an episode of House of the Dragon where it's about the history of the houses, or like in an episode maybe they talk about the history of what happened to them, and then it shows it, like it actually shows it. That could be like a one episode thing of the whole of that premise. Maybe
that would definitely change things up formula wise. I think that could work, because before, I mean, on Game of Thrones, D&D made it clear they would never do flashbacks in the show, and then they went back on that, of course. But House of the Dragon,
exactly. But D&D aren't involved anymore.
Yeah, thank God. But then House of the Dragon went on to do time jumps and such, and I think they did flashbacks a few times. But yeah, if they were to do a special episode where they would jump forward or backwards into certain eras to show us to highlight the Targaryens in a certain way, I think that would definitely be interesting, especially if they don't decide to go forward with further spin-offs about Targaryen centric events. So I think that could work.
Yeah, I kind of hope they don't.
And yeah, and after that, the next spin-off, the first Targaryen Conquest. It's basically about King Aegon Targaryen conquering Westeros for the first time with his sister wives, and uniting the Seven Kingdoms under one rule of House Targaryen. We know the story. It's been mentioned in almost every season, I think, of Game of Thrones, and it's acknowledged a few times in House of the Dragon.
I think Arya talks about it, doesn't she?
I believe so. I know she acknowledges the sister wives, and I think she highlights.
Yeah.
What's her name? I'm forgetting what her name was, but she was the one who wielded Dark Sister. That was a cool name sword.
Yeah, I remember that bit. Yeah.
But yeah, again, another Targaryen show. Don't think we need that with House of the Dragon right now.
Again, they can do a flashback to that in House of the Dragon.
Yeah, they could. Maybe one of the characters could have a dragon dream, and they get to see with their own eyes the events of the conflict and how it was resolved.
Exactly, a dragon dream. That sounds cool.
And one of the other spin-offs here, this was one that was a short-lived concept pitch, and essentially it was called The Seven. And this spin-off was basically about it would basically follow 7 people who would basically become the influence for the 7 gods. The father, the smith, the warrior, the mother, the maiden, the crone, and the stranger. And it's essentially doing good deeds, helping people, and that would influence the people to view them as gods. And of course, this pitch didn't go far because, again, this doesn't exactly sound like a multi-season storyline that you could invest in. At most, maybe a TV special.
It sounds a bit like. If that, it sounds like just because there's so many characters would have to be involved. It sounds like the Eternals.
Oh God, yeah.
And that didn't really work out, did it?
No. But yeah, good to highlight that at least. And the last one, and you could just tell from the title alone that this would have not happened, and thank God it didn't happen. But this spin-off would have been called Flea Bottom, and this series would have centered around, as the title suggests, Flea Bottom, the King's Landing's most poorest and infamous slum district. And we have literally no summary or whatever of what this show was or could have been about. The only thing that we can sort of theorize about is that it could have been about Daemon Targaryen, or at least he could have been involved somehow, because we know from the books. I think it's touched on in the show that he has connections in the underworld of King's Landing. So, and Flea Bottom is like heavily centered around the darker sides of the city. So that would have definitely probably played some element into the story. But we literally do not know if this show would have been an anthology series about different characters just trying to survive in this slum district, or it could have been about one certain character who would have risen up and become someone more notable in the lore going forward. It could have been anything, but at the end of the day, just the premise alone and the title alone, I just feel like this doesn't feel like something that I think people would have investment in selling or advertising.
No, it doesn't sound very fun as a show. And yeah, exactly. The imagine trying to market that. It's like, yeah, this is a Game of Thrones spin-off about people who live in shit. Do you want to see that? I'm sure you do.
Oh.
The worst of, not the worst, like the lowest of the low. Enjoy. No, thank you.
Yeah. Now let's move on to more promising content. And yeah, I think it'd be nice to sort of wrap up, conclude it with a final segment talking about another spin-off that is all the rage to talk about now. Now, this was announced last year.
The most bizarre spin-off that I've ever heard of. Go on. Yeah,
I'm not gonna lie, I was surprised too when I heard about this, and I'm not gonna lie, it's grown on me since then, in a sense that I'm anticipating it that bit more, just because of how different it is. But it was announced last year that a sequel spin-off was in development of Game of Thrones, starring Kit Harington as Jon Snow. So again, not so many words. This show is basically a sequel to Game of Thrones, which would be the first, because all these spin-offs previously have all been prequels, but this is the only one so far to have a sequel element. And what's notable about that is that not just is this what happens after, but this is something that we don't even have for context in the books, because again, the books aren't finished. But also, Martin, as far as we know, Martin has, I'm assuming he would have no investment in continuing doing stuff post the ending of his story. So this is definitely greatly different territory with doing a story post the ending of the ending that's not even finished yet.
Yeah, isn't Martin supposed to be involved in this?
He is. He's involved in all of them in terms of creative wise, so he's probably giving them a lot of concept and pitches, and he'll give them feedback and ideas on how he thinks they should handle the story and the characters. And in terms of this, I think he did come out saying that the show, this project is like, it was confirmed to be in development as long as the other spin-offs, so it's clearly had some time, to be worked on. Allegedly, I think as of like late last year, they did confirm they had, or at least it's been suggested they have a full writing staff and a showrunner has been attached. And we don't know for sure at the moment how far this project is in development. And for all we know, again, like the other ones, it could be put on the back burner depending how things go with House of the Dragon. Again, again, I'm going into blank mode here, but I don't. This show isn't even greenlit yet, so it could, if all we know, it could end up being killed off before it even gets the light of day.
Oh, I thought they actually announced that it was being made.
Yeah, it was. I should say it was leaked. Rather, it was leaked by like a journalist that it was in the works. So if the HBO had it their way, they probably wouldn't have even announced this for like a long time, even probably around now. But yeah, it all came to light last year, so of course people are aware of it, and we don't know for sure how it's going at the moment. What I have heard though is some interesting things. One is that it's rumored that it will only be a limited series, and I guess it really depends how you feel about how things went with the final season to think where you could go with that. Because if it's just a limited series, it makes you wonder what the story would be for them to only do it in a short amount of episodes. So, because if they're doing limited, they're likely not going to set up for like multiple seasons. It could change, but when you say limited series, it's like, okay, so you're clearly going to be telling one certain story over a short amount of episodes. So what is that story going to be?
Well, that's exactly what I've been thinking. What would the story be? Like, if it's Jon Snow with the wildlings and like Tormund, but there's no White Walkers because they've all been gone, what would the story be? Like, it doesn't. That's why I said I was confused when I heard it being announced. It's like a Jon Snow spin-off. I'm like, I like Jon Snow and I like Kit Harington, and I'd imagine he wants to do more if he's the one that pitched it. But like, it doesn't scream potential to me, because it's just like it would literally just be them in the snow. But I guess that's why it's limited, because they probably don't have much to talk about.
Yeah. Well, I do have some ideas, let's say, of what I think they could do with this story if it does go forward. And I'll highlight here just one more like piece of trivia that I think is notable, just to at least acknowledge. Now, we could have some form of an idea of what we think the story could be, at least this one brief element. And again, this I would say is quite flimsy at best, because this is more about the actor's opinion himself rather than confirmation of this is an element that we will explore. But basically, Kit Harington, I believe he went to some fan event last year, and he basically was talking to fans about something, and then of course the conversation went to Game of Thrones. And when responding to a fan's question on whether or not he felt his character could find another love interest after losing both Ygritte and Daenerys, Harington responded, revealing that he believes it's hopeful Jon could indeed fall in love again. However, considering everything he endured and has been through on Thrones, he'd likely suffer from a lot of PTSD. I can imagine. So from that alone, you can sort of gauge, okay, so the story could be at least have the element of Kit Harington, of Jon Snow suffering from all the trauma he endured during his time during the War of the Five Kings, and maybe the story could also include him finding a purpose again, finding someone to rely on after everything he went through.
It'll be Tormund. he'll shack up with Tormund. That'd be a great ending.
Yeah. So moving on from that, adding on to that. Sorry, I've got some possible concepts that I think they could do in terms of story for this show. So I'm curious to get your opinion on what you think of them.
Go on.
So the first one is a premise that I would just consider an epilogue. So this entire series, this mini-series, this limited series, it could end up just being an epilogue to Series 8, where it's literally just maybe like 3 to 4 episodes of Jon basically dealing with a minor conflict, but it's primarily almost like a highlight reel of his life, where it would cut back between past, present, and future events, where you would see returning Game of Thrones characters pop up. So you would have a flashback maybe in 1 or 2 episodes where you see Jon talk with Sansa or Arya or Bran, or you would have him talk with characters or interact with characters that we never got to see him interact with enough or at all with. So we see him interact with Brienne, or we see him interact with think of any character
Rob.
in Daenerys's group of friends, or Tyrion or Bronn, because there are multiple characters that Jon did share the room with throughout his time on the show, but we never got to see them really interact with. So this epilogue concept could be a shot for them to do that, where we could see him interact with them. And the whole premise of this is, I feel like, would be let's just get the actors back together for one last season and just really just try and tie up everyone's character in a bit more of a, remember the good times, remember what we suffered, but we're healing now. I feel like that's a very basic approach to a plot they could do. But yeah, I will say off the bat, I'm not too invested in this approach to it.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like we said about some of the other ones, is it would be a difficult sell because people were so, I guess, angry and disappointed by the last season that another season that is just sort of the same again, or like literally the same again, people wouldn't want to see it because of how bad it turned out before. And even if like the writing staff was completely different and all that, it would be a difficult sell. Like with House of the Dragon, it was like George R. R. Martin was doing it and it was set before Game of Thrones, it was all this different stuff. But if it was literally season 8 again, people would be like, no, please don't. And that's why, like, that's what I thought initially when they announced that it's a Jon Snow spin-off. It's like, well, people don't, we've had enough of Game of Thrones, like the actual original show, and this is just one of the characters that had a bad ending in that again.
Yeah, which is why I think this next one would be a bit more enticing, in my opinion, I'd say. So this next concept story, I would basically dub the real battle for the Dawn. So this one's an out there one, but I still think it is a plausible storyline they could tackle. And this hypothetical story pitch would feature Jon now basically being immortal and unable to die. And this would be a consequence of his resurrection from Melisandre, which, if you remember back in season 6 of Game of Thrones, he died and he was resurrected by the witch, the Red Witch. And Martin came out, I think, around that same time, confirming that he considers Jon and Beric Dondarrion, who also died multiple times and came back, he confirmed that they are considered fire whites. So this...
That sounds cool.
So this is essentially an expanded idea of that. So this story would then begin 100 years after the events of Game of Thrones. So this space, and Jon is still roaming beyond the wall. And
please kill me. I've had enough.
Yeah, it's
that's what it's like, the whole time. He's like, I know you know nothing. No, what would be a quote that he says in this? I know too much. Please kill me.
Maybe. But the whole 100 years time jump is something that fans have highlighted because it would be a great approach for them to not have to worry about bringing back everyone from Game of Thrones. When you jump forward 100 years, everyone's going to be either dead or very old. So there's no real need for Jon to.
And also, when is House of the Dragon set?
That's set I think off the top of my head, it's 350 years or something, or 700 years prior to the events of Thrones. So
sure, yeah, because I was just thinking it'd be a nice bookend, sort of like to the first prequel to Game of Thrones to be set, or spin-off to be set 100 or 300 years before, and then the next spin-off to be set 100 years after, because it would be nice distance from the show, with it being similar enough because it's not too long that everything will change, but it's enough that all the characters are different and the world I can't even think of that word, dynamics have all changed, but it's still similar to Game of Thrones.
Yeah, I think that the time jump is quite a appealing element to this hypothetical story, primarily because it allows a lot of time to pass, and we could see the changes that have affected the events of the world. And again, as unpopular as a lot of them were in the final season, I don't think anyone would be against at least seeing how they could implement those in a different story to complement them. again, I do think that that would be very difficult, but at the same time, I also think, and contradicting myself a bit, I also think it would be a good chance for them to not acknowledge them because the focus should be about just John, who is beyond the wall. He's not in Westeros anymore, or in the Seven Kingdoms. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's something they could at least touch on. But I think primarily the whole point of the 100-year jump is really just we don't want him to go through a storyline that repeats a lot of the stuff that we did in Thrones. So let's have him jump forward, but we don't have to worry about returning characters outside of just him and maybe Ghost, if direwolves can live long enough.
Or maybe Ghost is like not hypothetically telepathically connected to John, so like they can live together forever. And Tormund, I want Tormund to be in this show.
I can imagine in this pitch story, I could imagine Tormund being in just the first episode, where he's a very old man who lived to the ripe old age of 103 or something, and he's
Well, yeah, but Tormund would be like 150. Like, I don't think he would. And also, I think he would die at like of natural causes, like maybe 10 years after Game of Thrones.
I can imagine. I'm picturing it now. I can imagine the first episode being John coming back from a scouting trip or something, or maybe he's just finished a council meeting with some wildling lords, or chieftains, and he goes back to he visits Tormund, who's like a very old man, and he just comes to visit his old friend. They briefly touch upon the life they've had since the events of leaving Westeros and some of the conflicts they've endured, and then the next morning he comes to visit his friend again and he finds out he's passed away, and that's like that kicks off the story with he's lost his last friend now, so now what does he do?
Yeah, or that sounds pretty cool. Or like it starts as soon as Game of Thrones is finished with Tormund and the wildlings the same like age, and then like the first episode is he going through life, he's the same, but then they all grow old and they all die, and then Tormund dies and he doesn't have any friends anymore, and then it starts.
Yeah, that could work. Yeah,
because that will sort of easily show the concept of him not aging if he looks the same while they get progressively older and older.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, and that's just the prologue, because the meat of this concept story would be that not only is this picking up 100 years later, but we would then discover, or John would then discover, that the White Walkers are once again rising. So again, tackling this approach, this is a story that I think, again, highlighting Game of Thrones here, that the White Walkers were poorly handled in that, especially when it came to how their storyline was resolved by Arya, a character who had no connection to that White Walker story at all until just the previous episode.
No.
And it was built up for Jon.
It's so stupid.
Jon was meant to be the end game for that fight, that conflict, and they passed him aside just because the writers were stupid.
What was the point in bringing him back?
Yeah. So this whole concept of the White Walkers not truly being defeated, this would basically retcon that. And I think everyone would be all for this. That, we didn't stop them. We didn't, do our job. We didn't live up to the prophecy or whatever. So this story would be about Jon basically finding out the Walkers are coming back in some form, and he now knows, I'm the only one left. It's my responsibility. I didn't do enough last time, so now I'm going to. And he basically travels to the land beyond winter, the land of always winter, and basically plans to confront them head on. And from there, they could go either way. It could be a story about Jon finding out more about the Walkers and this is where Martin could come in, give us a bit more insight into their culture and their context, or maybe even just in general how we could get that the cancelled Bloodmoon story that we never got, where we find out more about their origins. That could be how they explore it through a different lens instead. And I again, I said it earlier, I don't think people would be against this idea of getting basically an alternative version of season 8, where it's just more faithful to what we expected, where Jon is the hero, Jon's the one who we expected to see it through to the bitter end and come out on top, or at the very least be the one who resolves the conflict in a satisfying way for him as a character.
Yeah, genuinely, that does sound really interesting. Like I would be interested in seeing that. But yeah, like it would be a good part of the story if it was like Arya just stabbing the main White Walker, or the Night King, with the Valyrian steel. That didn't kill them. Like it killed them in an instant, but it wasn't like the long-term solution. And the long-term solution is what Jon will have to do in this episode, like, or in this series. Like like in the story of the first Long Night, or whatever it's called, where the guy had to like make his blade, and he had to kill the lion, and then he had to kill his love, and then he had to kill all these things to temper the blade, all these things to actually be able to win the fight. It was something more like that, rather than just straight up Arya just killing him by doing a cool little trick. And having an actual conclusion. It would be a really good retcon to make Jon the actual point of that whole thing, and I think in that case you'd have to bring the Night King back again, because the whole point of like Jon and the Night King is like that one stare off they had. It's like, oh my god, that's setting up the final battle, and then like, well, they didn't get one. Yeah. You need to have an actual proper one-on-one fight between the Night King and Jon, and like that's what they could do in this. Like bring back the Night King, because that is magic, and you can find out a way to do it. He can refuse himself together or something.
Yeah, maybe one of the episodes would open with the scene recreating Arya stabbing the Night King, and the moment he shatters, you would see his essence or something maybe flow off into the wind, and it would then take us past the wall back into the north, and we would eventually see him form again some other place, and from there he would take like another generation, like 100 years, hence the time jump, to reform again. So, yeah, I feel like
exactly.
There's so many other interesting ways you could have resolved the White Walker storyline. Again, I highlighted it before in our Old Thrones podcast episode. I think it would have been cool to have them explore the idea of making a pact between the living and the dead, and that's something I still think they could do if they wanted to. Yeah. I think that would be definitely interesting, and I will actually touch on that element in a future video down the line. But yeah, closing this part off, there's one more element I think I would like to add to this concept pitch, and that would be that we could, in this story, I know I said earlier, this pitch heavily builds on the idea that we wouldn't need to see returning characters come back. But I would wager there are a few faces that I would like to see return, just for very minor roles, or at the very least minor recurring roles. Because I do have this cool idea in my head where, picture this, Jon is maybe he's travelling closer to the land of always winter, and we finally get to see him face off against ice spiders. The creatures that serve the White Walkers, who they were talked about a lot, a few times, but we never saw them. And imagine he's defending himself against like a small horde of ice spiders. And he's almost like...
It'll be like that episode of Mandalorian.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. And he's basically like... He's sort of getting to a wounded point. He's like, oh, I'm getting tired. I don't know how long I can keep going. And he's in the moment where he's dazed, he's in the snow, and they're slowly approaching him. And then he suddenly hears someone speaking to him. And the person approaches him, and he looks up, and it's his father, Ned. And they keep talking to him.
I was thinking it might be Benjen.
But yeah, it's his father, Ned, like Ned Stark, and he's talking to him. He's like somewhat encouraging him, but then the figure shifts, or we see them get closer, and there's someone else, and it's Dany, and she's also encouraging him, but she's then slowly getting a bit more condescending. She's like accusing him of, not doing enough, of giving up, and then the figure then forms to Ramsay, and he's full on, at this point saying, "Give up, mate. Die. Join me in death. You can't keep fighting them. You're gonna die." And if you see, I wonder if you're getting where I'm going with this. Basically, have Jon, through his isolation of living for so long, have him almost hallucinate, or maybe this could be some form of magic where he is genuinely communicating with the deceased spirits of his family and friends and enemies. But I wouldn't go that far. I would wager this is more of a mental problem that he'd probably be going through. But yeah, the idea, if they wanted to bring back classic Thrones characters for an episode or two to tie into the story, I could imagine this scenario where Jon is struggling mentally with living for so long, and he starts to envision people influencing him in his actions. So in this case, we've got his father, who is encouraging him to keep fighting, to never give up. We've got Daenerys, who is sort of on a similar fence, because they did care for each other for a time, but through the actions of others, they ended up becoming enemies. And then you've got Ramsay, who was like a full-on psychopath, who's like, "Yeah, you're in a bit of a shit moment, mate. Maybe you should give up." So yeah, that moment could end with Jon, like, depending on how he chooses to react to the situation, pulling through or giving up. It really depends. But yeah, what do you think of that little element?
As a concept, I don't like. I don't think it's the best concept as a thing, just to have like, look, there's a way to bring back the best characters from Game of Thrones is to have it as a ghost, because I think that would just be sort of like a cheap way of bringing them back, and a weird. I think it would just be weird, and if it might feel a bit like pandering, I guess, or like sort of shoehorned in. Like, it doesn't seem quite as natural. For like, after 100 years, Jon is suddenly now hallucinating all these random people. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can definitely see it in that light. Alternatively, you could chalk it up to the story narrative of, oh, he's lost his last friend recently, so that could definitely have an impact on him. But again, I also would agree that having them be literal ghosts, that can make or break it, because again, that's not something that we've really got to see in Game of Thrones. The world itself is very much grounded, even though magic is a presence there, and that's something that is a lot more heavy in the books compared to the show. So it would be something different.
I thought you were going to say that Ned Stark comes back as like a White Walker, but he's talking.
Nah. I mean, I'm sure they could, again, considering these would be illusions. I think they could maybe play with that. Maybe have them appear as White Walkers for a brief second. Maybe play into the fan theory about, how there was a fan theory for a while where Daenerys was becoming like the Ice Queen or something. Maybe that could be a little fun thing.
Yeah, that was a great fan theory. I'd love that. Uncle Benjen, like I said, could come back because you didn't actually see him die. You just saw him get surrounded by White Walkers. So he might still be fine.
But yeah, I guess overall for this concept piece, I would say this is my most anticipated one that I would suggest, just because I think it'd be more satisfying for Jon as a character, and I think it would be a lot more fulfilling for the White Walkers fans out there. I like, without the sort of ghost element of him hallucinating, I do think it would be a really good concept to have a White Walker, like basically White Walker round 2, where we get a proper resolution to the story, and like you said, it could be a combination of the epilogue to Game of Thrones, and then Jon 100 years with the White Walkers coming back, and then it could also have the elements of the origins of the White Walkers sort of all wrapped into one, rather than making them all separate things.
It might just make it have a bit more stuff to talk about, or a bit more stuff to happen, without having to make shows specifically about one or the other. But I like it.
Thanks, mate. So the last concept pitch here, the idea here, that I think I could see them doing for a Jon Snow series, is a completely original Beyond the Wall conflict. So this simple story would literally just be, the focus would just be on Jon trying to deal with a new conflict that's affecting the wildling community and himself. Maybe this would be another tribe, maybe it would be something else entirely or something new, but this story would basically exclusively just focus on Jon alone. Again, feature maybe him and Tormund likely, because I imagine this story in this scenario, maybe like at most 5 or 10 years would pass. So it wouldn't have to be too much of a big jump. So Tormund could be a lot more prominent in this story along with Ghost. But yeah, this story would basically be about Jon and Tormund just trying to like find purpose with themselves in this new period of their lives. And it would be about them fighting a very, very familiar or very, human enemy, essentially. No big conflicts with mythical creatures. No big event for fighting for a throne. Just trying to figure out how to survive. This story, I feel like this would be the safe option to go with, where they don't have to do anything related to the past seasons, but they don't do anything too big or law changing with the White Walkers, or retroactively changing. This would just be, let's just see what Jon's up to for 5 to 10 episodes, and then it can end. Then it would probably end with him finding a new love interest, settling down, accepting his new purpose in life, and from there we could just assume that he lived to a ripe old age, and then he dies living a modest elderly life.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that is what I thought when the season was first speculated or announced or whatever, when it was first talked about. That's what I thought it would be, just Jon and the wildlings having new conflicts with each other. Nothing too drastic.
Yeah, I mean, a part of me does imagine it, and also in this concept, I could see them somewhat including Daenerys, just as a sort of be it a vision, be it a memory or flashback, or maybe just be something completely else, completely different. I could imagine she could have some minor cameo element in it, just because, again, acknowledging the love interest element to it. I feel like that's something that they would touch on, and I think Jon would have to come to grips with that. And
I think Emilia Clarke would probably come back.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, the actors, yeah. I believe they're still friends. I think they are friends, yeah, in real life. So I'm considering this is his passion project, and considering how I think it's quite accepted at this point that we all know that both of them were very disappointed with how their endings turned out. So I can imagine him putting out an olive branch to her and letting her come back for one scene that sort of maybe redeems her in some, at least in Jon's eyes, maybe almost like a. You can't forgive me for what I did, but in this moment I can encourage you, or something. I don't know. Again, there's better ways to word it or execute that concept.
Maybe Drogon could just come around and drop the body, and then leave, and that'll be it.
He just drops a big skeleton.
Yeah, oh, fucking hell. Yeah, with a silver wig on.
All of a sudden becomes with Westeros and Friends. or medieval fun time land.
Jesus Christ. Yeah. Christ. I hope not.
But yeah, so those are that's the story pitch section over. So yeah, for all of the spin-offs in general, as of now, House of the Dragon is the priority. It's what HBO is focusing on the most when it comes to the world of Ice and Fire, the world of Westeros. So at the moment I think it's pretty accepted that we're not going to be expecting anything from the world expanding coming soon until at least maybe after season 2. And there is a possibility that they could announce any time from now, or maybe by the time this episode even goes up, we might know for sure, we are getting a Jon Snow. This Jon Snow series is happening, and we're going to get that July, August of next year after season 2 of House of the Dragon finishes. But putting my little idea out here, I actually think it would benefit them if they played the long haul here. And what they should do is put all their focus into House of the Dragon concurrently until they finish the full series. Now, as of now, we know that House of the Dragon Season 2 won't be coming until summer of 2024. So that's a full 2 years, well, roughly 2 years since the first season. And if that's going to be like the staple of how they like release the seasons going forward, that means we're not likely to get the end of the series, which, and again for context here, Martin came out last year admitting that he thinks the show could be told in its entirety in just 4 seasons.
That doesn't seem like that many.
Yeah, but 4 10-episode seasons. And that I mean, again, considering he's the author, he wrote the books, so I think I would trust his judgment. And also considering that he came out around the same time Thrones was ending and saying, I think the show could have lasted 10, 13 seasons if they told the story more faithfully. So, and considering how fans reacted to that, it's like, yeah, that should have been the case. So
yeah, they should have done. Yeah.
Yeah. So in this case, if he's predicting that, I definitely think that could be on the cards for how they want to tell the story. And again, so back to what I was saying. Sorry, that roughly puts the series to end, I would say, at most around 2028. So,
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, so a bit a while away. But if they want to, they could put out other spin-offs between seasons. But what I think they should do is that they should actually release Jon Snow's show after the 4th and final season of House of the Dragon. After when that final season airs, whether it's 4, whether it's 3, whatever season number they're on, when that last season airs, they should then end it with a little teaser saying, Snow, find out what happens next. So and so, 2020 something.
Find out what happens next. It's like it's a 1950s cartoon.
But yeah, so full focus on dragons, get that story done, keep all of their focus there, and then once that's in the bag, then they can focus on the other stuff. And I think what they could do with Jon Snow's show is that could be almost like a little interlude where it's more like in between. You watch this must-see in-between event for Game of Thrones where it's not about the conflicts that you've been invested in previously. It's now about something completely different and fresh and new. What happened to Jon Snow? And that would be a nice little buffer, I think, for fans, especially if they're by this point, if they're very invested in all the prequel stuff. Having a little sequel, I think, would be a nice change-up. So what they could do there is release the final season, then release Snow. And again, depending how things go, if that is just a limited series, they could have that out in a few weeks, and then that's it. Again, for all we know, they might end up turning that into a full series of multiple seasons, but again, at this point, I would doubt it. But after they've released Snow, then they could focus on the next big thing. Depending on what that thing is, it could be Sea Snake, it could be 10,000 ships. But I would wager that it would definitely have to be Hedge Knight, the Duncan and Egg spin-off. Because, again, as we've talked about before, that is the show that has the most source material backing it. So there's a lot more narratives that they could work with. Again, I said that. And the reason why I decided to push it all back is because I think that, again, give them this like 7-year period of time, that should be hopefully plenty of time for Martin to put a bit more work into the short stories, so we could get more books, more installments in the book series, and hopefully more of the actual Game of Thrones books themselves by this point. So they have more source material to work with. So when the day should come for them to do Dunk and Egg, whether it be a TV series or also a limited series, or maybe even a TV movie, if they want to go that way, but they could have more backing with the narrative. if they allowed themselves to take a break and just focus on what they've got at the moment. Just as a last little add-on, if they do end up releasing Jon Snow in 2029 instead of after 2028, instead of 2028, not only would that allow the audience to get more thrones the year after, but releasing it 10 years after the final season of Game of Thrones aired, that would also pay off Tyrion's words to Jon in the last episode. Ask me again in 10 years.